Thank you for a wonderful beginning to our day. Chaplains have been present at Harvard since the very beginning in one form or another. But never has there been such a breadth of faith traditions represented as there is among the body today. Such diversity presents both challenges and opportunities for us. The challenge is to learn to engage one another across our differences in such a way that the encounter strengthens and enriches us all. The opportunity is, if we meet that challenge, we will have an opportunity to make a contribution positively impacting the world far beyond the confines of this campus. We will go from this place to other significant places and carry a story forward. About 4 years ago, something important began to happen in the life of the Harvard chaplains. A process of listening to one another's stories was undertaken in a way that we had not done before. Our goal was not so much to understand each other's traditions as a set of tenets or beliefs. It was rather to understand each person as someone living in the midst of a tradition. Out of a series of encounters with one another, spanning the next 2 years, something remarkable began to happen among us. The bonds of friendship deepened. We began to trust each other in ways that had been difficult for us before. And most importantly, a new vision of what we could do together began to emerge for us. The Congress on the Future of Faith at Harvard is the direct outcome of what began at that moment in time. In this event today, we are endeavoring to take what we discovered among ourselves that was so enriching and to share it with the communities we are privileged to serve. We believe that today marks an important step forward on our common journey. Now, in naming this event on the future of faith at Harvard, the planning committee realized that the word faith is not one that is used by all persons in this room. Recognizing the limitations of that word, but being unable to find a more comprehensive way of speaking about those ultimate concerns that bring us to this time, we finally chose to use it provisionally. We invite all of you to help us in our encounter together to develop language that will express perhaps more fully our common aspirations. I want to just share with you a few very quick assumptions that we chaplains bring to this day. Today marks the beginning of a journey and not an end point. Secondly, it is not easy to talk about one's personal faith or one's individual beliefs at Harvard, but it is important and even vital to do so. Thirdly, we will overcome our hesitancy by sharing our stories with one another honestly, including our struggles, our doubts, and our difficulties. We will listen deeply to one another, creating safe spaces in which to hear and to be heard. Fourthly, we will not seek to minimize our differences, but to understand and appreciate those differences, trusting that differences enhance community. Fifthly, out of respectful conversation, we expect to deepen our sensitivity to and our understanding of one another's traditions and the persons who live within those traditions. Finally, it is our hope that some students and chaplains will commit to continuing this process out of today by helping us to plan the next steps for carrying forward whatever is begun in this place. We are privileged to have 4 persons who are going to model for us this morning something of what it means to share one's own story as a person in the midst of a tradition. I'm going to invite the panelists to come forward if they would at this time, and I will introduce them to you. What will happen in the panel that is about to take place is that these persons will be modeling for us what we will be doing about 45 minutes from now in our small groups with one another. They will be speaking to the very same questions that will be before us that are found in your program booklet. Our first speaker this morning is Nuri Friedlander, brand new to the Harvard Chaplains. Nuri is the visiting Muslim chaplain. He is a PhD candidate in the study of religion at FAS. Grew up in New York City and brings a fascinating perspective to us. James Croft is one of the leaders, the vice chairs of the Humanist graduate community here at Harvard. He is also a degree candidate, PhD candidate in the relationship between the arts and human development in the School of Education. This is his second go-round in Cambridge. His first go-round in Cambridge was actually in a different country, I believe, for 4 years. Sharon Weiss Greenberg is a teacher and a director of the Hillel program of the Jewish Learning Initiative on campus. She and her husband are co-directors of that program. She also is a PhD candidate at New York University, where she is engaging a theme of education and Jewish studies. Her particular interest is in the role that gender plays in Jewish summer camps, and you may hear a little bit more about that as she tells her story. Finally, Danielle Graham is a United Methodist, a senior at Harvard College. Danielle brings a very interesting story to us today. She is the founder of an organization called Kids for Peace, a nonprofit that now has chapters all over the world. And just this last week, Danielle was presented the Young Humanitarian Award by UNICEF as one of the outstanding persons in the youth division around the world in terms of the kind of work that she's doing. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce these four remarkable persons to you to share something of their stories. And they will go in the order that they are listed in the program, beginning with Nuri. Thank you.
Good morning. I have the great and somewhat unfortunate honor of following Reverend Gomes. Thank you for that inspiring talk. I'm afraid I'll be somewhat less inspiring. I'd like to frame the few words that I'm going to say here with an understanding from the Islamic tradition, which I follow, which is the concept of unity. I think one of the basic and most essential principles of the Islamic faith is unity. And I'd like to offer the search for unity as a frame through which you can view the story that I'm going to tell. It's always difficult to ask the question, where does a story begin? I think it's far more appropriate to ask, when do we decide to begin telling a story? And when do we decide to stop telling that story? I'd like to begin my story with my father, who was born to Russian Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn and grew up nearby in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And when he was a teenager going to Mass Art, he discovered a spiritual life, and he had a teacher in the Gurdjieff work, which progressed to eventually lead him through a long journey through various teachers of the Hindu and the Buddhist, and then finally the Islamic tradition, when in the early 70s, a group of what are commonly referred to as the Whirling Dervishes came through New York and did a performance at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And he was so taken by these individuals that he invited them all back to his house for tea afterwards, which they responded to very well. They said, that's what we do in our country, and nobody here seems to have this practice, so thank you very much. And he began to regularly visit Turkey, and he found a spiritual master and eventually converted to Islam and had me. And that's the environment that I was raised in. This tradition that he came from put a great emphasis on storytelling. So growing up, all of my bedtime stories, all the stories my father told me when we were taking car trips, were coming from this tradition of teaching stories, which always taught some kind of insight, some kind of moral or spiritual teaching. And that was my first real religious instruction, were these stories that my father told me. Growing up in New York as a Muslim who doesn't look particularly Muslim, if there is such a thing as looking particularly Muslim, created some challenges for me as to how to frame who I am and who I considered myself to be. It certainly would always come up that I was a Muslim because my name is Nuri. And people would say, oh, what does that mean? I say it means light, and it comes from the Arabic, and my father's a Muslim, and yeah, I guess he was a hippie, and it's kind of weird, and no, I won't have the pepperoni on my pizza. And for many years, that was the extent of my identification with this religious tradition that I was born into, but which my father had the privilege and opportunity to choose for himself. And some of the stories my father also taught me growing up were of his own search. And I got this sense of adventure and of this time that was gone. And hanging out with him and his friends from that generation, talking of traveling to Turkey and Morocco and Egypt in search of these spiritual masters and finding them and sitting at their feet. And this idea of being a seeker, which somehow I felt had not been offered to me as an opportunity because he had done all that work for me. And so there was this kind of wanderlust in my heart, I think, for a certain while, where I wanted that experience of going off and finding my own truth in the same way that my father had. When I was about 15, I got that opportunity, but again, not by my own choice, when my father accepted a job at the American University in Cairo, and we moved to Egypt. But there, my identity as a Muslim took on a whole other meaning, because whereas in New York it had set me apart, in Egypt it made me a part of a society that at first appearance I was very much not a part of. And so that identifying as a Muslim in Cairo made me one in this society that actually felt very foreign to me. So it was probably towards the end of my high school, it was definitely towards the end of my years in high school that I made the decision to commit to practicing and being a Muslim, which was something I had previously rejected. I've been given 10 minutes, so this is a very condensed version of a longer story. And that was, again, through traveling with my father to Turkey and meeting the spiritual master. And my father had been encouraging me to, I guess you could say, submit myself to this person as my spiritual guide, which I had resisted greatly until he walked into the room. And I was this 17-year-old boy from New York City, and this elderly Turkish man entered this room, and I was overwhelmed by this deep knowledge that whatever it was this man was doing, that's what I wanted to do with my life. And that was a turning point for me and a transition, and it was something that then when I went back to New York and visited my old friends there, I had to explain, why I had changed who I was and what I was doing. And many of them didn't understand it, but they accepted me. College was an interesting experience for me because I went to the American University in Cairo, and again, I was surrounded by people of this faith tradition. And during those years, I acquired some very deep friendships with both Muslims and some Egyptian Christians. And we would go out and explore sort of the religious terrain of Cairo, and we would go to different saint celebrations and different Sufi gatherings and seek out these masters in what I thought was a similar way that my father and his friends in his generation had done before us. We journeyed to Luxor. We took a train, for 10 hours to Luxor and got up on the roof to watch the apparition of the Virgin Mary all night long, and then, took the train back at dawn. And then after college, I moved to Damascus, because one of the things I'd found was that the Egyptian students, my colleagues at university, had all gone through a certain religious education in their schooling, which I had not. And so I went to Damascus and I enrolled in an Islamic college there. They had a special program for non-native speakers of Arabic where we did intensive Arabic study, and we studied jurisprudence and the Quran and exegesis and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And I was again surrounded by seekers like myself who had come from all different places in the world looking for what I was looking for. I think that was a time in my life when everything around me, it was the only time in my life where really everything around me was defined by my being Muslim and was part of my being Muslim and contributed to my being Muslim. And I look back on that as a very special time, but as one that was necessary, temporary for me in my journey. Because at the end of the day, I am an American. And while I know some people who have stayed abroad, eventually I was brought back here. And it's only now that I'm living as a Muslim with my faith in this context that I grew up in that really created me. It's only here that I actually feel the most at home and accepted in all of the different aspects of what makes me who I am. So when I said in the outset that I'd like to frame my story with this concept of the search for unity, it's the search for unity both in the universe and in myself, and in coming to terms with what at first glance may appear to be disparate aspects of my person, and even at odds with each other, I find more and more are actually contributing to this one and unique whole that I have become. Thank you.
Hello. Excuse me. I'm James, and I'm a choir boy. You can probably tell there's something about my angelic features and the slight haze of a halo above my head. As a kid, I loved singing in Sunday services. I loved the sense of ritual, the quiet aura of the space, but most of all, I loved the singing. And this is really nerve-wracking to do. Of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be, He is Alpha and Omega, He the source, the ending He. Of the things that are, that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. I love that one. Thank you. I remember once going up to the altar to be blessed, something that I didn't usually do, and I could see the Reverend moving down the line of children with their heads bowed and smell the incense in the air, and he was placing his hand upon their heads one by one. And when he got to me, he pressed really hard, as if he was trying to squeeze God in there. And I wondered, perhaps he knows I don't believe any of this. You see, I'm an atheist. Don't worry, Professor Gomes, I'm not an undergraduate atheist. I grew up in a happily non-religious family. My values come from the rational, pluralistic vision of Star Trek. In fact, I'm pretty convinced I'm named not after the King James Bible, but after Captain James T. Kirk. And I used to watch the stars with my grandfather, visit the planetarium with him, listen to Carl Sagan on the television, and contemplate the wonder of a universe, no God included. So it's a little strange that I should be here speaking with you today. I'm a representative of the faithless at a gathering of the faithful. What am I doing here? Well, this is a question that another of our attendees, Chris Stedman, a humanist leader in the interfaith movement, regularly encounters. I'm here because in the UK, my atheism was never a problem. I debated spiritedly with people of all religious faiths and found my position generally respected. I had a place at the table, and I drank lots of tea. Then I came to the USA, and here in my first few weeks at Harvard, I met a fellow graduate student in the canteen of my graduate dorm. "You don't believe in God? Are you serious?" He laughed uproariously, flinging his hands into the air before slapping them down on the table which sat between us, causing the glasses on our canteen trays to ring and the cutlery to jump. "So what? You think all this," and he gestured expansively, encompassing all of everything, "just sprang up out of nothing, with no reason behind it?" I wish now I had given a more eloquent response than a surprised yes, my eyebrows raised in astonishment. I remember how my fellow Harvard graduate student prodded at my beliefs as if I was some strange exotic curio, asking, "If you don't believe in God, where do your morals come from? And isn't your life meaningless without an ultimate purpose?" Now, if I were someone inclined to take offense, it strikes me that these could be seen as offensive questions, implying as they do that the only route to a moral life is through religion, and that my non-religious worldview must therefore be ethically deficient and devoid of meaning. But after 4 years of living in this country, I'm no longer surprised when I hear such sentiments expressed. Instead, I'm sometimes relieved if the worst that someone has to say about my worldview is that it must lead to an amoral and meaningless existence. I don't find myself to be a believer in a land of non-belief. I find myself to be a non-believer in a land of believers. Because since then, I have come face to face with many more egregious examples of what can only be called prejudice against humanists, agnostics, and the non-religious. I've heard televangelists shriek that people who are not traditionally religious are responsible for social breakdown, crime, and even natural disasters. I've heard news reporters casually describe non-religious people as de facto supporters of Stalinism and Nazism. I've noted how it seems to be impossible for a non-believer to be elected to high office in this country, how public declarations of faith are required by those aiming highest. And the effect of this all hit me on a secular service trip to New Orleans, which I went with the Humanist chaplaincy here. And I met Bill. Bill attends humanist meetings, but refuses to pose for group photographs because he fears, should his atheism be revealed, that he would lose his job. And seeing all this made me want to work harder for humanism, and brought me to Greg and the Humanist chaplaincy at Harvard, and called me to apply to become a Humanist chaplain myself. And my experience with the Humanist chaplain has been profound for me, because it was on that same secular service trip where I met Bill that I was able to resolve my struggles around my sexuality and come out of the closet as a gay man. So I have a lot to thank this humanist community for, this group of atheists who helped me find myself. This is my unity. Now, not all of us here are atheists. In fact, I imagine there are very few here. But all of us, even though we're committed to different issues and different values, want our story to be heard. We don't want to be dismissed. We don't want anyone to tell us just because of the values we espouse, because of our faith, that we aren't worth listening to. That commitment, that everyone should be heard and no one left out of the discussion, is part of the founding principles of this country, which for now at least we all call home. In America, we're part of a remarkable experiment, a country in which people can believe what they choose, can strive for their own version of the good, can pursue their idea of happiness, and will not be excluded because of their beliefs. That's why the Pilgrims boarded the Mayflower, right? And made that long, dangerous journey to these shores, landing not so far from where we are today. That's why I find it so shocking when I hear Rick Warren on television during the last presidential election saying, "I could not vote for an atheist because an atheist says I'm not I'm totally self-sufficient by myself. And nobody is self-sufficient to be president by themselves. It's too big a job. Now, I want you to imagine that Warren had been talking about your faith group. I could not vote for a Catholic. I could not vote for a Jew. I could not vote for a Muslim, a Hindu, a Sikh, a Buddhist, or an Anglican. Can you imagine the uproar that such a statement would cause? I think that the principles which beckon the pilgrims across the ocean, which enable Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus to practice their faith, should protect atheists and humanists too. I think that whatever we find our religious and spiritual calling, whether it's the song of the muezzin or the law of a star-dusted sky, we deserve to be heard. And that's why interfaith discussion like this is important, and why it must include people like me. And this particularly matters now, at this moment, because let's face it, the dialogue around religion in this country is broken, and not just the dialogue between religious and non-religious people. Certainly, I think of the fact that there is and only ever has been one openly atheist member of Congress, and no openly atheist senators, none. But I also think of Pastor Terry Jones, who thought it would be a great idea to pile high copies of the Quran and threaten to set them alight, or those protesters who rented decommissioned missiles and pointed them at the proposed location for a Muslim cultural center and mosque in New York City. Now, there are two potential responses to this. We could get angry, atheists tearing down religious political candidates, Muslims burning copies of the Bible in an ever-escalating war of words and actions that brings us all down. We could all get our own missile, or we could get smart and begin to engage with each other in a more respectful and productive way. And we are the perfect people to do this, because in this room are the leaders of the future, politicians, faith leaders, business leaders, people who will be in a position to influence discussions around faith in this country. And now is the time, right here, when we're all gathered together in one room, a remarkable and rare opportunity to engage with each other, to come to know each other more deeply. So I'm asking you to dig deep, for all our sakes. Share your story honestly and openly, and listen to the stories of people who disagree with you profoundly. And we will disagree. As an atheist, I'm skeptical about the future of faith at Harvard, and as a gay man, there are many people in this room who I'm sure hold beliefs that I find profoundly difficult. But instead of sitting at home or sitting in the Humanist Center and talking to people who already agree with me, I came out here because I know how important it is to be involved in the discussion. So don't hide your differences. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable, to give of yourself, and be brave enough to listen. If we can do this, I see a future in which atheists, Christians, Buddhists, Jains can all sit around a table, breaking bread together, sharing their stories. No more piles of the Quran waiting to be set alight. No more missiles pointed at mosques. And perhaps an atheist senator or two. Thank you.